Long you there.
No.
Okay. Right now, you're up.
Okay.
All right. Well, actually,
No, you're up.
so item one on our agenda is call to order. The meeting will come to order at 6:37 PM, Liam. Item two on our agenda is those present. We have Julie Gonzar, Noah Nagrin, Liam Erickson, and Andy Blanchard on the committee. Item three on our agenda is approval of the minutes for February 11th of 25. Do I have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes for the last meeting.
All right, thank you, Andy. Do I have a second?
A second.
All right, second by Julie. Those in favor?
All right.
All right.
Yep.
So Liam, if you're in favor, that's unanimous.
Yeah. All right, yeah. Andy, second by who?
Julie,
Julie, all right. Unanimous, got it, thank you.
appreciate that. All right, item four on our agenda is Harbor Master's report.
Just a few items, Liam, for the notes. We're having a crab kill on 7:30 PM on May 17th, this Saturday. There's a shellfish survey on Turner's Bar at 0900 on Monday the 19th.
Wait, slow down, sorry, crop kill 7:30 on Saturday, the what?
Yep, 517.
Yeah,
Then there is a shellfish survey on Turner's Bar at 9 AM on Monday, May 19th.
yeah, got it, thank you.
Other than that, right now, the flats just reopened, effective at 4 PM this afternoon, with the exception of the conditional areas 2, 3, and 4, which is Docks Creek, the Nonsuch River, and the Upper Sky River. Those conditional areas are still closed until 5/24 of 25. We had run the shellfish lottery. We appointed 2 new students and 1 non-resident student. Those licenses got scoffed right up in the lottery. And I've heard from a lot of people that they're doing crab kills, so I have a list of that and been getting them the logs. That's all I have.
It was 2 students and what?
1 non-resident student.
Sweet, thank you.
Yep,
What about commercial resident?
all the commercial renewed. Every commercial resident renewed.
Okay, thank you, Darren. Item 5 on our agenda is council liaisons report, but Scott is not here, so item 6 is general public comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to do a public comment before your presentation? All right, logical. Thank you. Public comment is closed. Item 7 on our agenda is old business, but there is none. Item 8 on our agenda is new business. And we have management presentation on sea level rise impacts on the marsh. Emily, take it away.
Awesome.
Wait, pause, please.
Oh.
So just, item 7, new business, there's nothing,
Old business, there's nothing.
or excuse me, yeah, old business, there's nothing, so. All right, very good, ready to roll, thank you. Sorry, Noah, ready.
All right. If we're sitting over here, can everyone hear?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll
okay,
pick you up.
great.
Yep.
Perfect. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So I was just gonna do a little bit of background, get everyone sort of up to speed, and then Emily's gonna dig into sort of more of the results of this project. So this project was presented to this committee about 2 years ago, maybe a little longer. And it came out of a Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Working Group meeting. That's sort of where this idea was generated. That's a group that we helped to convene. It convenes the 14 municipal shellfish programs in Casco Bay, including Scarborough. At one of those meetings several years ago, Nate Orff, who used to be a harvester in Scarborough, came to us with some concerns and ideas around how storms and rainfall and sea level rise were impacting the flats. In particular, noticing that when really heavy rainfall events would come through, that could shift a lot of sediment that impacts, harvesting and where shellfish can be located. And then he also had the idea of, maybe you can use drones to try to actually track some of this change in the sediment, recognizing that Scarborough has such a dynamic situation with how sediment is kind of constantly moving. So that was sort of where the seed got planted. And then from there, we sort of started to do some research, realized pretty quickly that this is a very overlooked habitat, mudflats in general. We don't really know that much about how storms and rainfall impact sediment in mudflats or how sea level rise impacts this area. So we were able to get some funding to do 2 pilot site studies, one in Scarborough, one in Penobscot, working with the Shellfish Committee up there, and Bailey Bowden, their chair. And the idea was really that we wanted to, maybe the next slide, actually. We wanted to start to really understand sea level rise and also storm impacts on mudflats. Again, we don't know much about it, but we do know it's a pretty important area for us to better understand. It's particularly for shellfish harvesters and municipal committees. Maine right now, we know sea level rise has already started to impact mudflat habitat. Maine right now is managing or preparing for 1.5 feet of sea level rise in 2050 and 4 feet in 2100. And so we're really left with the questions of, what does that mean for the loss of mudflat habitat, loss to access for shellfish? What can we expect, under these different sea level rise scenarios? How does that impact the fishery, the people that depend on the fishery? And so we really went at this by trying to gather lots of different types of data, which Emily will talk more about in just a minute. But we were using drones to do aerial surveys. We were looking at really fine scale elevation of the sediment. We were, good, perfect. So yeah, we did some drone surveys on Turner's Bar. We did a lot of gathering of historical imagery, so aerial imagery of the flats all the way back, I think, to maybe the 50s. We gathered LiDAR data, so again, that really fine scale elevation data of the flats to sort of look at different sea level rise scenarios. And then I think most importantly, we did interviews and mapping with the harvesters in Scarborough. And so that was really an effort to document what harvesters have observed in this system as they've been, experiencing change. And we gathered so much incredible information. It was it's actually overwhelming how much we were able to document. And I think that was such a critical piece of layering in that knowledge that the harvesters brought to the table with all of these other types of data. It really sort of was a way for us to ground truth and get a lot of context as to what's happening out there. So yeah, with that, I think I will pass it down.
So yeah, just to build on what Marissa said with these different kinds of data we tried to pull together, we definitely, this was very much a pilot exploratory effort. And so we kind of just tried a bunch of different things and tried to figure out what we could learn from each of these different approaches. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that came out of it. And then we put together an online story map that I think I've shared with you, Noah, that has a lot more of the information that came out of this to dig into some bit deeper. So one of the first things we did was sit down with harvesters in Scarborough. We interviewed, I think, 7 different harvesters with varying ranges of length of experience harvesting. And this is one of the things that came up from a number of different harvesters that we talked to, that the window of time to access the flats prior to low tide has gotten shorter in the last decade or so. That a couple of people said it used to be around 3 hours in certain places, and now it's 2 or 2.5 before low tide that you can get out onto the flats to harvest. So that was a really kind of triggered a lot of, there was a really important observation and change for us thinking about, okay, how can we then look into some of the data out there to try to understand what's happening? And specifically, I think more than half of the harvesters we talked to mentioned the clay pits area in particular as a spot where when there was a minus tide in the past, there used to be a flat that you could harvest right at the bottom of the boat ramp, and that has been pretty much underwater all the time, in the last 10 or 12 years. So that was another clear example of some of this change that people have been seeing. And you can kind of see in these photos, this is from the 1990s and 2021, and both of these were taken around low tide. I'm not sure how low the tide was those days, but you can kind of see the difference there, in the water level in those 2 years. And so we've been working with some geologists and kind of sea level rise experts at the Gulf and Marine Research Institute and the University of Massachusetts Amherst to try to dig more into some of these dynamics. And so the observations about the length of time to access the flats over the last decade are really reflected in some of the tide gauge data that's out there. So this is data from the Portland dive gauge showing this increase in mean low water over the last century. And you can see there's really, I'm sure this is obvious to anyone that spends time on the flats, there's a lot of variability. And there's one of the biggest sources of variability is there's 18.6-year planetary cycles that kind of dictate this kind of fluctuation in mean low water and sea level in general over time. But if you zoom into the last decade, there's been a 10-inch increase in mean low water. And so those observations of in the last decade, the access to the flats and the time that shrunk is really reflected in this tide gauge data. And this is not Scarborough, but just as an example of what this kind of looks like aerially from satellite imagery, this is McCoy Bay in Brunswick. And this is where mean low water was in 2015, this red line. And then this is where mean low water was in 2023, I believe. So a pretty significant change in where the location of mean low water has been. In the near term, because of those planetary cycles that I mentioned, it's actually expected that sea level is going to drop from the 2023-2024 spike, and the tidal range will increase again. So mean low water should get lower in the near term over the next decade. But sea level is going to keep rising kind of as a longer term trend. And so thinking about the targets that Maine is committing to prepare for with 1.5 and 4 feet in the longer term, we wanted to try to understand what that might look like on the flats, kind of beyond these 10-year or 18-year time horizons. So one of the things that we did was look at green LiDAR data, which is LiDAR that is flown from a plane, able to take really fine scale elevation in both submerged and non-submerged land. So it gathers elevation data in the intertidal, and it allows us to look at how mean low water might advance under different amounts of sea level rise. And so this is actually, there's new LiDAR data that just came out maybe 2 weeks ago that was flown last year. This is actually data from 2018. We want to do this analysis with the newer data. We just didn't have it at the time. So this is 2018 elevation data. And the light blue here is the area between mean low water and mean sea level. So roughly where the mudflats would be. And the dark blue is the subtidal area. And this is just what is it called, a bathtub model. So it's literally just looking at what the elevation is now and then add 1.5 feet on top of it. So it's not taking into account any of the kind of dynamism of the area. But basically with 1.5 feet, you lose about 25% of that means low water to mean sea level. And with 4 feet, you lose about 84%. And this is really, I recognize, kind of a startling image. It's a little bit.
Excuse me, would you give me those numbers again so I want to put those in the notes. Would you just rewind 1 second, please?
Sure. Sorry, I'm talking too quickly for you.
No, you're good. You're good. Thank you.
So the under 1.5 feet of sea level rise, you lose about 24% of that area. And then under 3.9 feet of sea level rise, you lose about 84% of that area.
Thank you.
Yeah. So kind of a remarkable change, but I think one of the really important things is that this is not a great assumption because it doesn't account for any of the dynamic processes that are happening in the system. So we really don't have a great sense of whether or how tidal flats will be able to keep pace with sea level rise, but it depends on the sediment supply in the area. It depends on how sediment will move around. It depends on some of those tidal cycles. So there's a lot that we don't know, but we thought it was helpful to look kind of at a very rough scale, what kind of change might be anticipated in the long term. So that was just a quick summary of some of the really sea level rise specific things that came out of this project. The interviews that we did with harvesters, there was a ton of other information that was shared around erosion that's been observed in different areas of the marsh, storm surge and flooding in particular places, how seed settlement has changed. We heard quite a bit about the loss of mussel bars and how those used to hold finer sediment in where they existed. And as the mussels have disappeared, the finer sediment has been lost and there's been a real change in those places. We heard a lot about the impact of development, both historically with the railroads and the jetty and how that changed the system, and then also more recently with development happening in the area. And then we heard a lot about sediment dynamics, places where areas have kind of shifted between predominantly sand to mud and vice versa, kind of shifts and changes in the location or height of sandbars and channels, and then a lot about the dredging in the area and how that's impacted things. So there's a story map, which is an online platform that has maps and quotes and images and information from a lot of these different pieces that has much more detail about all of these dynamics. And I think maybe Marissa, if you just want to really quickly talk about some of the like future work that we're thinking about.
Yeah, this again was just like a pilot study that we, went into just trying to, basically start to gather what we could, recognizing that we would need to gather a lot more information. And so we're excited that there's a lot of interest from our partners to continue this work and really look at sediment dynamics in particular. And so we were working, as Emily said, with GMRI and UMass Amherst, and those folks have gone out and started taking sediment samples that they can analyze in a lab. So they start to really understand exactly, how the sediment is composed, what the grain size is, organic content, all sorts of things. They're also taking, again, sort of the elevation data of the mudflats. They're putting out water loggers, water level loggers, so that they can actually get some information about the tide as it's going in and out. And then we're going to continue to sort of pair this with other sources of data, drone flights. In some areas, we're going to be doing shellfish surveys. We're going to continue to do the participatory mapping, like we did with Scarborough. We're going to expand this to other towns as well. And yeah, try to really get, and also use some satellite data, which is proven to be pretty useful in some instances. And again, just really try to get more information about this pretty overlooked habitat, right? Like mudflats just have not had a lot of attention in terms of really trying to understand what's going on out there. So yeah, lots going on, and we're going to be, working on this for several years to come. And then, yeah, just a few things to pull out in terms of, what this data and this story map is maybe useful for the committee. I think one of the important things that Emily mentioned right in the beginning was really, understanding the estimates of how the window of time to access the flats is changing, what folks have already observed and what might be expected going forward. If it's useful for planning for conservation activities, particularly as we go forward and learn more about sediment. And then, There's also questions about jurisdictional boundary. We didn't talk too much about that, but municipalities manage the intertidal, and once you get to the subtidal below mean low water, that's state jurisdiction. And so as that mean low water line moves, that actually moves where towns versus the state have jurisdiction. And that's a much bigger conversation that is gonna need to be had at some point. We've kind of started to scratch the surface and talk about this a little bit at the state level, but I think that's a pretty important thing that we need to start thinking about. And then again, the story map, you know, anything that's in there, you know, if it's useful as a way to communicate about what's happening on the flats or share these observations in a way that's visual, with people outside of the committee, with people who don't spend their life on the mud flats and maybe don't understand what's going on out there. You know, we hope that it's useful. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
I have a question just to clarify. So in layman's terms, I think I'd like to think I would have gathered a little bit better if I was sitting there with you all. But when you talk about the jurisdiction, is that like, does the municipality, are we gaining right, like say or rights, so to speak, or are we losing them as this happens?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the trend would be towards losing, because if more of the flats are fully submerged at mean low water, then that would fall under technically the state jurisdiction rather than the town jurisdiction. And I think it's a little bit confusing, having tried to look into state laws around how the boundary is defined. It's a little bit different depending on the fishery, so I think there's some questions there, but yeah, it would be a trend towards losing jurisdiction for the municipality.
Thank you.
All right, appreciate that. Emily, was there any other questions?
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
You talked about there's an 18.6 year planetary cycle and how that affects the tides. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I'm curious about that and maybe where we are. I think you had alluded to that that's shifting. Are we at the end of that cycle, starting a different cycle? And is that why you had mentioned that the tides might actually, like the water might actually recede for a short amount? Can you just talk? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so this is definitely like beyond my area of expertise, but my understanding is because of the rotation of the moon and the cycle, like it's on an 18.6 year ellipse in
Okay.
terms of its orbit. And so that dictates an 18.6 year cycle where tides get bigger and smaller over that period of time. And then there's all this other variation that happens in between due to warming and sea level and pressure and wind. And so it's pretty variable, but that's like the big picture trend to my understanding. And we are just starting the downturn of that cycle where the tidal range will get bigger. And so it was where we were at this period of sea level going up more than just like the trend of sea level rise because of that planetary cycle. And now we're going to be in the near term going down and the tidal range will get larger. Did that make more sense?
That. It's kind of like the climatology of the tide cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. My other question is, and you had mentioned that there's a lot of dynamics because you talked about like the bathtub model and that's one theory of looking at it, but then there are all these other things about water that you have to consider. Do you think that groundwater and like the geology of groundwater is taken into consideration of how water is absorbed in the groundwater level and how that might affect your data?
I do not have a good answer to that question.
Just something to think about.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
We can pass that along to the geologists that we're working with who might have a better sense of.
Yeah.
Yeah, just something to think And then will there be a copy of the presentation? I'm interested
Yeah.
in the story map at some point.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, Emily, if you email me that presentation, I'll get it over to me.
Great.
All right, did anyone online have any questions too?
Yeah, I guess I have maybe a kind of another question, but I don't know, this feels a little bit like a silly question, but is it your I guess it sounds to me like my great grandchildren will not be digging clams, Scarborough. Is that your if you were a betting scientist, is that what you would say?
I think it's probably pretty hard to say because it really will depend on. I think we can probably be fairly confident that the area of mudfloods will be smaller,
Yeah,
but I think it really depends on things like sediment accumulate, whether the elevation of the flats is able to increase and what development looks like along the coastline, what the health of the marsh looks like. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors, but I think trending towards a smaller area of flats in the long term.
all right.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I would just add like, some of the unknowns there, a lot of the sediment supply in coastal systems just comes from erosion from land. And so, as sea level is rising and there's more storms, there's generally gonna be more erosion, and that's actually supplying sediment in some instances to the mudflats, which might help them to keep pace. There's also a lot of unknowns about if the mudflats are gonna actually migrate, like in places that they could, they're not gonna be able to migrate in all places, but places where mudflat meets like salt marsh habitat, we could see that migration so that salt marsh habitat actually starts to turn into mudflats. And then you would start to see, there's still mudflats, they're just in different places. But again, it's just sort of a lot of unknowns. And I think that's where like phase 2 of digging into some of the sediment dynamics of this project is really going to try to at least start to help us get a better handle of that.
And that actually, I thought of a question after he asked that question about will the mudflats move in certain places? Will it open up more areas? Or are there these concrete boundaries where just because of I don't have the right word for it, just because of the type of environment, it can't move into a certain area because of certain reasons, or maybe there's areas where there will be new mudflats like over time that will start to develop, and that would be interesting to model.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of interest in understanding sort of the steepness of the shoreline adjacent to mudflats. And so that would be part of it, right? So if it's a really rocky, steep coast that your mudflat goes right up against, right, you're probably not gonna be able to go anywhere. But if it's a more gradual slope, and if it's more like vegetated salt marsh seagrass type habitat, then it's probably more likely that it would be able to start to at least move in that direction.
Phase 2.
Yeah.
This ties into the trend of the marsh migrating inland, right?
Yeah,
Not
I think there's
exactly.
Yeah, they're
There's-
similar.
sort of an assumption, I think, from some people that like marsh edge adjacent to flats will become flats, but I don't think we really know, like to the extent that might happen. So, but yes, definitely like everything's sort of moving.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to have a model of that, and just for future possible, I don't know, development. I mean, obviously, you're not gonna develop in the marsh, but it'd just be interesting to see a model of that on the edges.
I think
Big
it's
snapshot.
Yeah. I think it's another place where we also are gonna rely a lot on what the harvesters are seeing, because they're out along these borders all the time. And so if there are places where it seems like there's, erosion along the salt marsh or mudflat sediment moving in one direction or another, I think that would be a really important thing to try to document from the harvester perspective.
All right, any other questions online? Yeah, not seeing any. All right, appreciate it. So I guess, that'll be it for item 8, unless there's anything else. Okay, item 9 on our agenda is set next agenda. Does anyone have any items they'd like to discuss during the next meeting? All right, not hearing anything, so, I guess we'll say that June is TBD. If there's nothing on the agenda, we might shoot for July instead. All right. And item 10 is adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I have a
Like
couple questions.
to adjourn.
Please, I'm just catching up, no,
Andy, hold on.
so,
Hold on, so,
I just have a couple questions before we adjourn, just, I'm just wondering, so I'm still learning because I'm new. The crab kill on the 17th and the survey on the 19th, are there opportunities for like me to volunteer or help or be a part of that? I would love to learn more about how I could be a part of that. Also, I think we talked about water quality testing in the last meeting. Anyway, I'd be happy to volunteer to help with any of this stuff, so I just don't know.
Yeah,
How?
I can talk to you
Okay.
offline. Yeah, when we're done.
Bring a stick to the parking lot.
Andy, what's that?
I don't know. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
all right, I will second that motion. Those in favor?
yeah, I mean, I will, begrudgingly vote, being hurried along. Yeah, in favor.
All right, it's unanimous, okay. Appreciate that, we are adjourned.
All right.